And before we start, I just want to do a quick intro as well. So, hi everyone again. Doesn't matter where you are, morning, evening, or late afternoon. I hope you're not impacting by severe weather that's happening in certain regions of Canada and America as well. I want to thank you to tuning in to Canadian Cybersecurity Network monthly webinar series. Today we have Security Scorecard joining us to talk about navigating the rising tide, mastering cybersecurity in the regulation era. Please help me welcome Joseph Tasso, Director of Cybersecurity and Technology Risk Officer at Scotiabank, and Steve Cobb, CISO at SecurityScorecard. Steve, maybe you can start, share a couple of words about you, and also do sharing of the screen.
Sure thing. Yeah, I'll start. My name is Steve Cobb. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm the CISO for SecurityScorecard. My responsibilities lie in the protection and defense of SecurityScorecard, as well as helping customers and peers and having general discussions around all things cybersecurity, specifically supply chain, third-party risk, but as well as compliance regulatory needs as well. I'll throw it over to Joe and let him introduce himself, and then Joe, maybe we'll get started talking about these challenges around regulatory affairs.
Great. Thank you, Steve, very much for this. My name is Joseph So. Nice to meet everybody. I'm currently the Director of Cybersecurity and Technology Risk Officer for Scotiabank. I oversee a lot of day-to-day operation on the cybersecurity, but I also own the tech and cyber risk management program for the bank as well for the United States operations. So pleasure to be here today with the Security Scorecard and hosts.
Fantastic. So let's get started here, Joe. I'm going to share some. Let me get to the right place, and I'll share my screen here so we can talk about maybe some of the challenges that you see, that we see in the regulatory landscape. All right, something is messing up, so. All right, here we go. A little bit of background. Let's talk a little bit about where the industry lies today from a regulatory standpoint. Feel free to add some content color here, Joe, as we go through it. But what we see today, regulatory bodies kind of expanding their coverages of what it looks like for all industries, not just financial, Joe, which I know you have a major interest in. But if we think about healthcare and we think about just the things that are going on in SEC, FCC, all those sorts of things, there's some expansion of coverages and items that regulatory bodies are looking to provide guidance, discernment, and regulations and requirements on as well. One of the other things that we see, I think, is more and more signs of actual penalties being enforced. So, in days past, maybe there was always threats of penalties, and now we're seeing some of those things really come to fruition. So part of our discussion will be a little bit on that. Now, I want to get your take, Joe, too, as we think about some of the gaps between what goes on in the U.S. and in Europe around regulations, right? The many different compliance or regulatory requirements that exist in different locales around the globe, and maybe challenges that come with that for organizations. And then let's talk through action steps or some really proactive things that companies can do. Our audience that are joining us today, maybe they can think about around how they're struggling with some of these requirements and regulatories. Maybe we can share some words of wisdom or experiences from the School of Hard Knocks that might help people get through some of those challenges. So I'm going to kick off here with just some questions, and obviously, as was mentioned, we'll take questions if you have them as well to put them in the chat. But let's start off here, Joe. What are you seeing change in the regulatory landscape? And I know you have a financial kind of perspective, but you're a cybersecurity practitioner, so you talk to peers, you have them across. What are you seeing that's different or changing in the regulatory landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's from what I'm seeing right now, the current regulatory landscape, it is getting harder. And what I mean by harder is the regulators are really taking a more stronger look and stance at the cybersecurity and the technology risk management practices in any organization we have today. There are definitely nuances between the U.S. and EU regulations for sure. Where the U.S. you have your traditional CFTC, you got the Fed, you got New York DFS. Most of their
Mhm.
regulations are geared towards cybersecurity and tech risk management, but as well as also operational risk management, right? Our US privacy laws are scattered. It's kind of owned by states. We don't really have a overarching US privacy law. So that's kind of where the main differences I see from a EU perspective. EU, you have your GDPR, which governs all of EU, right? It's not by individual country or state. It's all over across the globe over there. They're they do have nuances in their cyber and risk management processes, right? That's what I'm seeing right now. That's kind of governed by country across the EU, but from a privacy perspective, that's really more, across the EU landscape, right? So that's governed by EU, but the individual privacy, cybersecurity laws, that's by country. So those are some of the
Yeah.
big differences I'm seeing.
Yeah, and when we think about GDPR or DORA in the European nations, those sorts of things, yeah, and you mentioned there are gaps for you all from your experience or what you've seen from or heard from peers. How are organizations that are global? How are they dealing with that gap and making sure that when they get a question from a customer or from a regulator that says, do you comply with GDPR? Do you comply with DORA? Do you comply with NYDFS? All those things, and you've got like a litany of all these requirements you have. How are companies handling that?
Yeah, so the key about regulatory body is like they want to see that you have a process, right? I think process is key here, right?
Yeah.
If you're able to demonstrate the process, I think that's key. But then the process also needs to be backed up with supporting documentation, right? Because from what I've seen from regulators, if it's not written down, you really don't have a process. They
Mhm.
may give you credit if you're able to demonstrate the process, but they may still, say, hey, listen, I see that you're doing it great, you're reporting it great, but we really want you to write this down somewhere so it could be, repeatable, right? Which is the key here, right? If the process can't be repeated, right, that's the key. They want to have comfort that this is a repeatable process, is well documented, and people know exactly what they need to do. That's where I see the regulators are leaning towards, right? It's not so much that you know what you're doing, really demonstrate how you're doing, right? Back it up.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I think as I deal with regulators on behalf of Security Scorecard or interaction with customers and trying to help them with some of those challenges as well. I think what the point you made really sticks out is for the most part. Now, their regulators are people too, so some of them are different as you engage with them. But for the most part, they want you to do better, right? They want to see you succeed. And so I think if you express to them that you're trying, you're making an effort, and you do have a process. Now, maybe the process isn't perfect, and maybe you can't get to all the requirements that you need at one time, and you're phasing those through. I have seen, I won't say leniency, but I have seen the opportunity to work with those regulators, right, for some compromise, if you will, even in the case of saying, okay, we'll be back in 3 months, or we'll be back in 6 months to check this. We need to see progress here. You need to be moving forward. And I think that's a consistent theme I've seen. Most regulators that I've engaged with understand that just what we said before, those compliance and regulations are expanding, and they know everyone's trying to deal with it. So having a little bit of grace, I think, is what I've seen from most regulators in those cases. But it is a challenge, and I think for organizations that are global, like Scotiabank, like Security Scorecard, these are things that we face constantly as well as we try to check the boxes and make sure we're meeting the regulatory requirements. Do you think? So let me ask you this general question then, Joe. From there, do you think the regulatory bodies are getting it right?
I actually think so. They've invested
Yep.
a lot in SMEs now, technical and cyber SMEs. They're paying a lot of money at these people to really help them, do these audits against companies. I think you hit it on the nail before, right? They want to work with us. They don't really want to give up penalties, right? That's not the job. They want to make sure that you're doing something right, that you are protecting, customers' funds, money, et cetera, right? So what I've seen this the leniency is where we as an organization is able to self-identify those issues, right? They don't want to come and say, hey, I found an issue on you. That's kind of bad.
Right.
But
Yep.
if you're
Yep.
able to find it yourself first to say, hey, listen, I'm gonna be transparent. Hey, I have an issue here. I found it, I identified it. Here's my action plans. This is what it's gonna take to complete it, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever the case may be. We have acknowledged it, we know about it, we know our senior management teams are aware of it. being able to demonstrate that overall governance and self-identification is what makes the regulators happy, right? Because then they know that you are proactively looking for issues that, listen, we're not perfect. No one is. No
Definitely,
organization is perfect. Everyone has holes in their programs. Is being able to identify those holes and then create action plans to fix them and address them.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that you answered both parts of that question too. Are they actually trying to get it right? I think they are trying to get it right in most cases. Right now, I've seen some of the regulation changes that have seen maybe I feel like they're maybe overstepping, or maybe the idea is that they're a little bit behind in the curve for cybersecurity and technology where it's at, and so they're working through those challenges themselves. But I do think they're at least trying. And look, especially as you know from the financial sector, I mean, we're relying on the regulatories to say that your organization, Scotiabank, and all the other financial institutions are doing it right and following guidelines to help protect consumers and keep things straight, right? So the spirit of getting it right, I think, is there and trying to do it. Sometimes that execution falls short, but as you mentioned, we're not perfect. None of us are, and I think for all of us, we all fall short there in a little bit. So with these challenges that we talked about, Joe, how are you seeing companies, and you can speak from personal experience or professional experience at Scotiabank or other places, how are you seeing them address these regulatory challenges? I mentioned the gaps in U.S. and European, but I think also you brought a good point up as well. Cybersecurity is an industry that changes frequently. I mean, it's ever changing, right? And so as companies have to meet the regulatory challenges and requirements that are tracking to the cybersecurity industry and these changes that they see, especially in new attacks or new vectors of attack and that sort of thing. Are you seeing people bring in SMEs themselves for companies?
Hello? Hello? Did I lose
I think
connection?
his power cut out for a second.
Let me just quickly address that. Hopefully it comes back online for our committee here right now. So to his point, yeah, it's one thing you need two things, right? You need SMEs on site to really, understand the company what we have today. But at the same time, we really need to rely on outside help as well too, right? Because especially consulting companies like your EYs, Deloitte, and PwC of the world, they've seen a lot more, issues out there with multiple tools of companies. So they're really best to help provide guidance because they understand across the board, across the industry, what people are having challenges with, right? And they're helping these organizations to understand how they could do things better. So relying on outside SMEs, I think, is a smart thing to do because, like I said, because they deal with more companies, they see more things. It's very helpful to be able to just rely on these people to give more insight because you're not going to be able to do it alone because we're only able to see what we know inside an organization. We don't know what other people are doing. We're not sure we're even doing it right sometimes, right? Because it's just a single view. It's best to have a third party to really, acknowledge whatever it is that you're trying to do is accurate, if that makes sense.
We do have a question on LinkedIn. With the current political uncertainty and shifts in business and trade, do you anticipate more conservative regulations coming into effect sooner? And how might the GRC professionals need to adapt to navigate these potential regulatory changes?
I think that's a great question. We are seeing a lot of political shifts today, right? In my personal opinion, there's constant changes in the regulations. We have to take a risk-based approach on how to navigate these potential regulatory changes, right? Being able to assess the issues ahead of time, gap analysis will help prepare some of these potential regulatory changes. I always tell people anticipate first what they're looking to change. Until they make it official, don't rush to make a judgment, say we need to do this now, right? Because I've seen regulations where they make a proposal to do something, and it seems like it's going to become enforced soon, but then last minute something happens and the regulatory body says, okay, we're not pushing this change anymore. They pivot to a different direction. So the landscape is constantly changing and shifting all the time. It does make it difficult sometimes for us practitioners to anticipate what they are. But the best we can do really is when you hear something is coming out, do a gap analysis, understand what gaps you have within your environment, right? And prepare to have action plans for those changes once you know for sure that the regulatory requirements are going to go live.
And then also we did have a question that in connection to the regulatory enforcement and penalties you mentioned, where can we access court cases, regulatory hearings, or podcasts? This person just wants proof of concept that changes are actually happening.
I believe if it's a regulatory enforcement action, at least with NYDFS, I know they actually publish who if they find and the issues that they find on their website. Some of the other regulatory stuff may be searchable within those public law law firm type of databases. I don't really always go into those, but I do know there some of the, like when you have a penalty or enforcement, they're usually public information, so it could be searchables, right? So usually those law firm websites, you should be able to find them there.
Are there any other questions at this current moment while we wait for Steve to come back on?
Yeah, it's fine. Any possible chance you could put the presentation up? I could probably try to plow through as much as I can.
I don't actually have the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, that 1 second. Let me try to reach out.
Apologies to the community. Steve is having some technical difficulties. He is also affected by the snowstorms. Steve, I think you're back. Are you back, Steve?
Hey, Joe.
Back.
Hi, Steve. Sorry about your difficulties. I answered that last question, so we could just move forward from there.
Okay. Okay, good. I apologize. I figured I wouldn't even bring up the questions anymore. We can just have a dialogue, you and I, and I'll bring the questions up as we go. That works.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I apologize again about my generator blipped. Did that earlier. So, all right. Let's see. Okay, so you talked about the regulators addressing the kind of regulatory challenges that come that companies are experiencing.
Yeah, I mentioned to the community that most people are leveraging third parties for SMEs for help, right? Because they do see more. They do see more of what's going on in the industry. So,
yeah, and it's just I wonder if you see in this as well. I see a lot of those consultants as me now that are coming from the regulator. They have a regulator background, right? They're leaving some of those regulatory bodies and they're performing consulting services for companies.
yeah, that's actually a very popular trend these days, to be honest with you. Like even us ourselves, we will hire sometimes a person from the regulators themselves, right? Because they've done the role, they're looking to work with the public sector now, so they shift their experiences over. They're either joining consulting companies or they're joining banks like ourselves directly, right? So it is common practice that we see those all the time.
Yeah, and I think it's valuable to your point that they have the experience. A lot of times they know what those regulatory bodies are looking for. They can help you preemptively check some of those boxes and answer questions before they get asked, right? So I think it's good. The next question I just kind of wanted us to touch on are about penalties. I mentioned we're seeing some penalties be realized now, and popular I think are the SEC rules where people are filing K8s if they have a breach and that sort of thing. But from a regulatory body overall, I think we're seeing penalties that have increased. Do you think that's something the industry should be afraid of?
I know for the public companies, you need to be a little bit worried, right? Because the only reason why a regulator will give a penalty, you have to be really negligent of what you're disclosing and what you're trying to do, right? They're not gonna just give you a penalty for the sake of a penalty. They're gonna give you a penalty because you really did not do something that you said you were doing, and they found a very large gap within the organization, right? I've got this question before a couple of times, like Joe, when you're in the CISO role, are you worried that SEC is gonna come and prosecute you, right? And they're only prosecuting me if I see something fraudulent, right? If I see something that's not true. We as professionals need to be very transparent of what we're doing, right? We don't want to hide things. You should never hide things to a regulator. Listen, we're not perfect. No one is perfect. And you see all the time on the news where different companies are getting cited for some sort of fine or penalty. And that's because they really had a negligence of what is it that they were trying to do. We need to do the best we can, demonstrate that we're doing the best we can, do testing all the time. Risk assessments are very good ideas. Control testing are great ideas as well too, right? Because the more you're able to self-identify and get ahead of those issues and address it, the less likely you're going to get a penalty, right? Because they want to be able to see that you're demonstrating. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some times where you may not do enough. They might give you a small penalty. It might not be a fine, but it might just be one of those warnings. Say, hey, listen, I'm going to just give you a warning or write up as audit. We'll go follow up in the 3 or 6 months where now you've done something or not. That happens all the time in the industry for the most part. But it's like, that tells me one or two things. That means one, they recognize you're doing the best you can. It may not be enough, right? So they just want you to kind of improve on those, right? So that's kind of what we see these days.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the, to your point earlier, I think that the story that comes out of that discussion there is, to your point, be transparent, try to do your best, and document all those areas where there are risks, that whether you can avoid the risks or mitigate the risk or not, at least document that information. That way, if you do find yourself in a position, you've got documentation to back up to say, we tried to do this a certain way, didn't work that way. We didn't have the funding, we didn't have the resources, we didn't have whatever it was, but at least you have it documented in that you were attempting to move forward there. Do you think since those penalties are real, how are companies calculating that? Like in their risk calculations, Joe, are you seeing, or is Scotiabank doing this, or are you seeing peers that are calculating in that potential penalty risk as far as how they're looking at budget, how they're looking at insurance, how they're looking at tooling, all those things?
Yeah, so one common misinformed knowledge is insurance does not cover penalties, right? So if you are getting a penalty, insurance is not going to cover that. Calculations is usually an operational risk. I'm not involved in that process. I can't really tell you how that's usually done, right? So someone is more usually on the non-financial operational risk side of things, where they will have those calculations. Every organization will have their own methods of how that's calculated, but they do take into account potential financial penalties based on the risk of what is it that you're trying to assess. So that is valid, that every organization do have their own methodology. Again, it's subject to each organization, right?
Yeah, and I think I know cases, scenarios where, like healthcare, for instance, the industry in healthcare may take a calculated risk from the standpoint of what they need to do to implement to meet a HIPAA standard or something else, versus what their cost is going to be and potentially what the penalty would be if they delay that, just from a budgetary financial decision, right? And I think those things all come into play. It gets really complex, right? It's 40 chess to a degree at some point when you get down the road and start looking at those things. But it's all things that as practitioners and professionals, like you mentioned, we need to be involved with stakeholders to give our input on what risk is and what the appetite of the company is. That then determines how they proceed most of the time.
Yeah, it's the problem right now is, like, you don't know how much the fine is.
That's right. Yeah.
The privacy laws might be a little bit easier, because I know some of the privacy laws says, for every disclosure of records, we're going to fine you X amount of dollars, right? So some of the privacy laws per state might be a little more transparent, but when it comes to, like, the primary regulators, SEC, the Fed, DFS, we're not exactly sure how much they're going to fine you, right? It really depends on how grossly negligent you are of the gap that they found, right? I mean, you looked at the news today of seeing some of the recent regulations. I mean, not just in cyber, but just across the landscape as an operation as a whole, right?
Right.
Those fines are pretty large. I've seen fines that reach into the billions, right? So it's
Yeah. Yeah.
it really depends on how bad you really messed up as an organization. So, but
Yeah.
that's something really hard to quantify.
Yeah. I want to rabbit trail here for a second, Joe, and talk about, because you mentioned the SEC, and I mentioned before with the K8 disclosures and those new, for public companies, some of those new regulations that come into play. Part of that regulation is a company has to determine if a breach has materiality. And so how are companies struggling or not struggling with the idea of what is materiality, right? I mean, I hear that question a lot, and there's some debates that go on through as professionals about your materiality and how you determine it. What's your perspective on that or experience there?
Yeah, so there's two things. One, if there is a direct impact. If it's a direct impact, yes, it's 100% material. Notify your regulators as soon as possible. If you are still trying to determine an impact, I want to call it material yet. Like, you have to first understand what has happened, right? Like, I'll give you an example. Like, people say, do I need to report that my workstation had a malware? No. If the malware didn't go where your EDR picked it up and blocked it, there's nothing to do. Okay, what if I seen the malware and it's doing some lateral movements and it's moving things around? Yes, I think that's material enough for you to report it because it is doing something, right? And that is a cause of concern because it is doing something. So because it is doing something, you should absolutely report it to your regulators because to me, that's material. Now, the problem you see the K8s, and I see them all the time, they're always vague sometimes because I have to report to the regulator and the regulator is going to put it on their K8 notification websites. Sometimes the information is not readily available. So you see very vague or generic statements.
Yeah.
You know that there is a breach, but you may not know what that breach is, right? Because it's like I said, it's very vague on those K8 websites, right? So, this is where I believe your third-party risk management program really needs to come into play. Like Scorecard is a perfect example. We use the tool all the time. Anytime there's a public breach and it is part of our portfolio, we'll get a notification and say, hey, this company got a breach. Great. I'm gonna start kicking off my processes now and then trying to understand what has happened to the company. Is there any material impact to my data that may be on that vendor itself, right? Does it pose to me a risk, right? So I'll start kicking in, my incident response programs at that point in time to kind of understand like what is going on for the most part.
Right.
But to your point, but to me, material is if something is really happening, it impacts your organization, systems are down, or you see suspicious activity, that's material.
Yeah. And let's dig in a little bit around third-party risk there. So, since we are SecurityScorecard, and that's, a lot of the area we play in as well as threat intelligence. And I wonder what your thoughts are on, I think we see a regulation shift. We've seen it in some regulations anyway. I'd love to see it more broad, widespread, but the idea that in our third-party and supply chain assessments, in the old traditional ways where we do questionnaires and a point in time, that the shift in thinking that we're going to a continuous monitoring, right? You mentioned it, you all do it with SecurityScorecard. You're continuously monitoring vendors for a breach or if they have a score drop and their cybersecurity hygiene drops and, you just kick off workflows. But what are your thoughts there on from a regulatory perspective, how that shift is going?
No, so TPRM and operational resilience has been a huge radar for regulators today. Both New York DFS and I know the Fed regulators themselves, they care about that very much. It shouldn't just be point in time because an organization risk posture can change over time, right? They have new tools, they decommission tools, These are things that you need to kind of continuously know. No, you send your initial risk-based questionnaire, which is fine. Everyone does it. How do you then continuously monitor the organization without, I want to say the word pester too much, right? Because you don't want to be too much of a nuisance either sometimes.
Yeah.
It is cumbersome. I get it. I take a risk-based approach, or organization will take a risk-based approach. You have to look at it as like, how critical is the vendor? If it's a critical vendor, then we might do like a yearly review. Some organizations, based on their SLAs, will do maybe a bi-yearly review, right? More like a kind of a catch-up, right? So they'll catch up and say, hey, what's going on? How are things going? So continuous monitoring, yes, is really important. Take a risk-based approach. It doesn't apply to every single vendor you have out there. Focus on the ones that are really critical to your business. Focus on the ones that have your most sensitive data. Those are the ones I think you want to pay more attention to, in my opinion. But yes, continuous monitoring is definitely important.
Yeah, and I think too that point you made at the end there is one that a lot of companies, at least that I talk to, struggle with around how do I tier my vendors, right? Or how do I categorize them? If I think about critical to high to medium low. For you and Scotiabank, Joe, how do you all make that determination? Like, how do you say vendor A is critical and vendor B is medium?
So we look at the operational resilience framework that's out there these days, right? It's based on critical business services, right? Identify, starting with the business first. What do they need in order to operate? They're going to define what is important to them. Once they define what's important to them, then that creates a criticality of highly important vendor or not highly important vendor. If this vendor goes down, what do I need to do? So this all ties back to your BCP plans and your DR plans, right? Because at the end of the day, your criticality is really based on the business. You have to work very closely with the business to define those critical business services, right?
Yes.
And then behind that, internally you might have some sensitive data. Sensitive data may not necessarily be a critical business service, but it is also sensitive to organizations. Like if I was in healthcare, for instance,
right,
the data related to my clients, the patients, that's very, very sensitive. I want to protect it, right? Is it where I'm hosting it myself or I'm hosting it with a third party? That third party now may become a critical business service because of the fact that they have data there that is sensitive. It could go down, may not impact anything, which is fine. But then what if it doesn't go down, but it just gets hacked?
Right.
I care more. I now care from the perspective that my data might have gotten leaked. So it may not be a critical business service, but it's critical enough to me because the data got leaked, and I got to do my records now because the health data got leaked, right? So I classify it two ways. One is critical business services, what's critical to business, and two, how sensitive is the data that I need, that if there is impact to the data of getting lost or stolen, that I have to be worried about.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that is exactly spot on. And I talk with so many peers across industry who really have and it's good, they should, but they narrow their focus on only cybersecurity incidents. They don't think about availability or business process like you mentioned. And one of the other challenges I think is a lot of times we make these decisions on criticality vendors in a vacuum without involving the business stakeholders to understand what really is critical. Because, you may have a application that's a human resources application or a finance application that from a cybersecurity or IT perspective, we don't know anything about. We don't know what's all in there, what it means if that system goes down, is unavailable, and not involving your business stakeholders to really grasp how critical those things are puts you in a really bad spot if there is something that happens with those applications, right? So it's really important to understand kind of application inventory and everything.
So I think something is very important for community. Like I've been talking to a lot of my peers right now, and our current set of, BCP RTO requirements these days, those definitions were created over 20 plus years ago. Ransomware did not exist in those days.
Right.
They were based on your traditional natural disaster type, power outages, hurricanes, tornadoes, you name it. I have RTOs and RPOs there that might be 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 24 hours, give or take. If you look at any ransomware attack today, no one's recovering within those timelines, right? You look at most companies, they're saying, I need a week, I need 2 weeks, whatever the case may be. It's almost like we need a shift in how we view things nowadays. You need 2 sets of RPOs, RTOs. One, related to your traditional natural disasters. 2, ransomware. How do I recover from a cyber attack? Like, are my numbers actually realistic right? And you're gonna find that most companies are it's not realistic, to be honest with you, because
Right.
it's a different way how you protect things, it's a different way how you recover things, right? You really need stronger cyber resilience in order for
Yes.
those type of systems to be
100%.
almost bulletproof, or at least recoverable in a very timely manner, right? So it
Yeah.
really changes how we view operational resilience and cyber resilience today, because it's not the same thing as a hurricane power outage anymore. It's not.
Yeah, exactly. I could completely agree. In fact, I speak a lot about cyber resiliency, and I think that is a shift that, we're talking about regulations here. I think as part of that, some of the regulations are tied to old world thinking and old style thinking as well, right? And some of those need to kind of move forward to where we're at, especially as we think about RTOs and RPOs and how we do recovery. Because some of those, I mentioned before, some of them I think are a little bit hindered by what we've always thought of around resiliency or recovery for some of those things. What do you think? So as companies are dealing with these vast, regulations they have from different regulatory bodies across the globe, do you see, Joe, a framework or something that's common that companies could pattern their cybersecurity programs after, that at least gets them to a place where regulators are saying, okay, you're trying to follow, whether it's NIST or whether it's CIS or whatever it might be? Is there a compliance framework or something that you hold near and dear to your heart, or one that you and your peers think are something companies should use?
I think what we try to do is these days is leverage a framework that's really recognized by the regulators. One that the regulators can trust. I think this is the most common one out there today, that when you say, hey, I have a NIST framework, and you're able to demonstrate what that is and show them the mappings, that really gives the regulators comfort, right? Because it's a really recognized strong industry requirement. ISO is great, but you need to produce the certification, right? If you're able to produce that certification, great. That's a very expensive proposition, to be honest with you. Not all organizations go for the ISO certification because it's very cost ineffective, but if you could do it, great. From an operational resilience perspective and cyber resilience perspective, there is I want to call it a framework, but it's kind of almost like a technical paper that this has published on cyber resilience that I've seen the regulators now reference several times. It's a very technical how to, almost like an engineering manifesto of cyber resilience, right? And I like it. It's strong. It's great. Some of the stuff there might not be practical, is because it's very engineering focused, but it at least provides a basic framework for you to follow, right? And I mean, I'll be honest with you, you look at even just your basic maturity scores of what maturity levels are across the board. NIST maturity levels at their highest rating is almost unachievable. It's like almost pure automation, right? And for you to do that, it's super expensive, and the upkeep and dev is just insane, right? You want to be practical, right? Like I always tell people, listen, when you try to score some maturity, don't go for the very best. Search for the middle ground, which is you're better than the peers. You're not the super best. You're like in that, if you're looking at a range for like 1 to 4, you're in the 3 category, right? So that's where you want to be, right? You want to be able to demonstrate that you're doing better than your baseline stuff, and you're at least evolving in certain areas. But I'm not there yet at the full automation. And to be honest, I still kind of question whether full automation of some of these things are even possible in the technology that we have today, right? So you have to be practical on your approach of how you achieve your cyber resilience.
Yeah, and I agree completely. I have discussions with peers around, really there becomes a point, a threshold, I think, if you look at NIST and most of the compliance frameworks, but NIST specifically, where when you get to that 3 out of 4, 75%, let's say across the board, that your return on investment to go above that really isn't there, right? I mean, if you think about it, that automation or that investment that you have to make to tick up to 80% compliance, it doesn't get you any better, right? It's really it's a pipe dream, if you will, in a sense of getting to that spot and saying, okay, we're better, we're more cyber secure than we were before. My argument is you're not necessarily better from a cybersecurity standpoint. Maybe you've ticked some of those automation boxes, and there's things that happen and workflows. But from a pure cybersecurity standpoint, I agree. I think there's a place of diminishing returns when you get there to that spot that you're really self-aware and take stock of where you're at and make a decision. Are we at that point? I've had this discussion with my CEO all the time. We think about getting better, and he wants to drive us to get better and better. And I love that. We want to get better and better, but there's a point on where you spend your money to get better, and where you put your resources, right?
Yeah, 100% agree with you there.
Yeah. Do you think so? As we talked about a little bit of those compliance frameworks and how companies are trying to meet or push themselves above that, how are regulatory? You mentioned before, I think regulators are looking at some of these frameworks, and they're holding them maybe in higher esteem than others. You mentioned NIST. I think that's probably what my experience is as well. Most of them come out and say, if you're 75% or 80% of the NIST framework, you're going to be in a really good spot. And the places where you may have gaps or other things, as long as you show plans or progress to a regulator, it gets you past the bar of what they're looking for. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I agree so as well too, right? You're not going to seek perfection. No one's perfect. You need to be able to demonstrate a strong risk-based approach and be able to justify what is it that you're doing and demonstrate that to regulators. If you're able to demonstrate all those items, like to your point, like 90%, 85%, whatever the case may be, to give them that comfort level, you're generally in a safe spot, right? Because like I said, it's very difficult to achieve perfection. And if we're trying to achieve perfection, and I'll be very transparent with it, and I've seen it all the time with just talking to my peers, you're going to fail. The regulator's going to find you because you're trying to do something that's impossible.
Right.
Don't. The regulators are smart enough to know that you're trying to show them something that's just unachievable, and they're gonna write you up for it, right? So don't do something that's you're really just not achievable.
Yeah. What do you think? Let me broach the phrase of the day, or the word of the day, and talk through how regulators are viewing AI and what they're looking at in your organizations when you say AI, or you tout that you have some type of AI in your product or services solutions. What have you seen there? Any good stories there, Joe, from interactions?
Yeah,
there?
it's they're not there's no regulation on AI yet. Let's just be very transparent out there right now. There's no regulation on AI.
Yep.
There's what I think the regulators want these days is, do you know what you're doing with AI? Have you started thinking about what to do with AI? If yes, do you have some governance around the AI you're trying to do? Two, have you identified where there is AI, right? Like, what software that you purchase as AI or what is homegrown as well too. So they just kind of want to know, do you have a process today to identify, govern the use of AI today? They're not saying no, you cannot use it. Right now, AI is kind of like the wild, wild west at the moment. Even with the VCs that I talk to all the time these days, they're throwing a lot of money into investments into next generation AI technologies. In order for AI companies to be successful, the business themselves needs to understand what are the use cases that they want it for. And that's what the regulators are looking for. Like, what are your use cases? What are you using for? Do you have a strong governing body around the usage of AI? Because AI is scary. And it's not scary because of the word AI, right? It's really also a protection of AI, right? Or what AI can do. Like, I'll give an example. Like, I use this analogy all the time, right? Let's say you're using Copilot. The Copilot is connected to your HR database and everything else in there. You could ask a question and say, what's my CEO making? And the AI is going to spit out, oh, your CEO is making $2.8 million a year. Should that be publicly aware in your organization? Probably not. You need to have safeguards in place, right? To make sure that, what the AI has access to and who is permissioned for is properly there. So like I said, it goes back to governance. Know what AI, what you're using it for, and make sure the provisioning is there. Because if the provisioning is not there, you actually do have data leakage if you think about it, right? Because like I said, I can spit something in there, or give me some sort of feedback. It may generate something because connected to the database. And guess what? All of a sudden, I have data leakage now because my AI is doing something, is overexposing information that it is not supposed to expose in the first place.
Yep. 100% agree. I think that's part of the black box that AI lives in for folks who haven't really deep dove into the how it interacts, what it's touching, all those pieces. And I think, when we think about, you mentioned, you're right, there's no regulation around AI, but I think it behooves us to show regulators and guide ourselves from our compliance frameworks around just good due diligence on where that data is going, who has it, even from a third-party risk standpoint, understanding our critical and high vendors or all of our vendors and what data they have access to from us and they're sharing with what we would call fourth and fifth parties, right? Because I think we're going to see, my preposition is that we're going to see in the near future where some of these fourth and fifth party down the line risk are extensions of over AI exposure, right? Or we've got this plugin that we want to use and it's going to help us be more efficient in our meetings or more efficient with our responses to email, or more efficient wherever it might be. Seems very innocuous, seems like, yeah, it just makes sense. But on the back end, all your data is leaking out to somewhere that may be very insecure, may not have the same rigorous security standards that you hold internally.
I'm actually expecting a new section within third-party risk management questionnaires just focusing on AI. Like, are you using AI today? Is my data in your AI platform? What else has like, it's like you're going to see more governance in every organization around AI, and then even from a third-party risk management process, because we know everyone's going to use it. We want to make sure that it's being used carefully, and this is where I think the regulators are going with as well. They're in a learning mode right now at the moment.
Yeah, agree.
They're trying to understand what is the industry doing. Are they doing it right? Do we need to create regulations around it, right? Because they can't create a regulation around something they don't understand yet. And like I said, most of the organizations don't understand it either. We're all in a journey right now, right? Some people might have adopted a little bit faster than others. Some people are still very behind. A lot of organizations still say, I really don't trust it right now yet, right? So it's an evolution today, in my opinion. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, I think AI is going to be very heavily used in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, agreed. And we're already seeing some of that. Even in our platform, some of our questionnaires, we're using templates around AI to ask some of those questions and gain knowledge. But I will say, a lot of time, this is one of the areas where I see a lot of creep from a standpoint of applications and plugins, right? You have sales teams or financial teams or whatever within an organization who, see an offer for something that makes their life easier, and without going through normal vendor assessment process or product assessment process for security issues, they just sign up for it and they start connecting it to their inbox, or they connect it to their Salesforce, or whatever case may be. And I think the challenge there is a lot of times it's so easy for them to connect these AI tools in that have so much access to data. Sooner or later, it's going to pop and be. You're right. It's going to have to think. We're going to have to think more about compliance and regulation around those pieces.
Yep.
So, as you think about that from the AI perspective and third-party perspective, are there things that you recommend for companies to do now to get ready for maybe coming regulations, or what would you say for companies to consider at the moment?
Honestly, I treat AI access no different from human being access, to be honest with you. Like, you just treat it from a cybersecurity and privacy regulations. It's the same thing. Understand the data and understand the access, and then what security controls do you need to protect it, right? It doesn't change, because at the end of the day, all AI is doing is accessing data. That goes back to information security, right? What information security controls do you have to access data? Access data reviews, right? Certification processes, least privilege access. These are all the considerations I think you need. So I don't think it really changes much of how we try to protect it. If anything, is really about AI is not a technology thing. I'll be honest with you. It's not even a cyber thing. It's a business practice at the moment, right?
It really is.
It's a business practice, right? Leveraging AI. So I think you need, if we don't have already, develop a AI council, AI committee. Maybe you can hire a chief AI officer as well too, right? It has to be governed there, right? You need to start creating processes to govern that. But as security practitioners, I wouldn't treat it any different. Just treat it as sensitive data and make sure you understand how data is being accessed.
Yeah, agreed. I think the only thing I would say differently there, Joe, is from what I've seen for AI company, we see so many just pop up, right? And when you dig into them, it's like two guys running it out of a shop from, in Santa Monica or something. My concern, and maybe this is me being a little old school and a little more conservative than most folks. My concern is that a lot of these AI tools that we integrate, I think at some point you have to make an assumption that if you would give it access to sensitive data, your sensitive data is likely available out in the public, right? I mean, because you just don't know what their back-end controls are. They could be linking directly to any of the public LLMs out there and streaming your data out to them without any data scrubbing or anything of those things. And it's really hard, as you know, as you go down further the third-party supply chain kind of pathways. Once you get past those initial relationships, it's really hard to determine what's going on out at the fourth and fifth party level, right? I mean, that becomes you lose control really quickly, I think.
No, absolutely. This is the reason why I'm saying the questionnaires you're creating today to do your due diligence on companies, you probably need an AI set questions as well too, right?
Yeah,
to make sure that the data is not being used by a third or fourth party or fifth party.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, well, let's see. We're coming up on the end. We've got a couple of questions, Joe. Let me try to frame them and see if we can help out on what some of our audience is asking. Somebody was asking the question about cost benefit analysis around disclosing promptly versus not disclosing promptly, and the idea that there's a fear factor for CISOs and other people to do that disclosure, as we talked about materiality, with the threat of being, well, either a penalty or fine coming, or I think you mentioned it as well, a vague K8 disclosure that may really send stock of a public company spiraling because all of a sudden they've admitted to a breach, right? What are your thoughts there? Is that tension between we're very transparent, we say we have one, versus, hey, we need more information, we're going to wait?
Yeah, so I think disclosures, I think being upfront of forthcoming to the regulators is more important than not disclosing at all, because if they find it on their own, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah.
And be honest, sometimes you disclose something to them, they say, you know what, we'll keep it watching it, but I don't think I care much about this time. And you get them all the time. Like it all depends on the level of criticality of the issue that you're dealing with, right? If it's not that critical, then they go say, you know what, thanks for the heads up, I don't care. Or they might say, you know what, I see there's an industry issue with this right now as well too. You're also dealing with as well too. I want more information, right? So, like I said, giving disclosure is better than not giving disclosure, because if they find out on their own, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I think that's where my experience with regulators is there's a little bit of a breach of trust there, right? You need to set up that trust relationship. You need to set up the understanding that you're going to do things on the up and up, and then they expect, just like you expect, for you to carry out your end of the bargain, right?
Yeah.
Another question.
I guess my
No, go ahead.
As a public company or financial industry right now, there are regulations that says you have to tell them something if something happens to you, right? From like a cybersecurity breach notification, right? You don't have an option not to be transparent or disclose, right? Because it's a regulation. You have to tell them if something happens, whether it's 24 hours, 36 hours, 72 hours, you have to tell them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you could tell them once you have at least some form of confirmation, to your point, is it really truly material?
Right. Yeah, agreed. I think there's indicators you can at least inform them that, hey, we've got a situation. We don't know all the data, but we're going to get to that.
Exactly.
You're going to be part of the process, right? I think that's key too. If you can involve them in the process of, hey, we're trying to figure this out, but we want to let you know, that goes a long way to meeting the questions, right? All right, so let's see. We've got 5 minutes left. Another question that came through, and you, Joe, maybe you got some insights on this that I don't, since it's specific for Canada. But the question is, do you foresee the government of Canada adding cyber regulations for its own IT purchases, like RMF, FedRAMP, or CMMC in the U.S.? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't know I know OSFI, from what they're trying to do, at least the financial organizations that are regulating, they are creating stronger requirements around it. Whether or not the federal government is trying to follow things like FedRAMP here, I don't really have an answer for you on that. I want to be honest with you. I primarily deal with mostly OSFI and the U.S. regulators for the most part, so that's kind of where my world is. I haven't seen much of anything in the news that they're looking to explore things like FedRAMP. It would be nice if they did, to be honest with you, because as a federal government, you want to trust that they're also protecting our information as well too. So it does kind of make sense that they should have some sort of due diligence process. Maybe they do have today. I'll be honest. I'm not that 100% familiar with Canadian requirements.
Yeah. And I think they have, I don't think they have anything as rigorous as what the U.S. has around FedRAMP or even state ramp. If you look at what some of the state some of the state organizations have got together and do. I mean, FedRAMP, so SecurityScorecard is FedRAMP and state ramp ready. And it's a extremely expensive and rigorous process to achieve that kind of certification or that assessment level. And one of the challenges I think that if Canada was going to do this is making sure that providers on them for, let's say, whatever the regulation is, right? I mean, that comes with a high bar. And, as we talked, you mentioned ISO before and even SOC 2. I mean, there's some organizations, those costs don't give back the benefits. And if you're not going to go through meeting those regulations, it may preclude you from actually bidding on opportunities or providing services to the government that they may really need. So I think it's really good to put those cyber regulations in place, but it has to be looked at through the lens of, can companies achieve this and still do it in an economical way where they can be profitable, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
So here's a note from someone that says Canada does not have something like FedRAMP or state ramp formal as in the U.S. Expectations are they will follow suit based on U.S. regulations in future from some vendors. So again, I think the points hold true. It would be good for them to set a bar there. They just need to understand how high that bar is.
The Canadian government has been they've been good lately that they are expanding their regulation entities and how they're increasing their sets of regulations today. So I think they are drastically improving. My understanding is they do work very closely with the U.S. regulators as well to try to work, closely hand in hand, right? Because at the end of the day, Canada is our business partner. We're right next door to each other. We have a lot of businesses that correspond with both regions, right? So
exactly,
being able to match the regulation as closely as possible, I think it helps both sides of the world. To be honest with you,
I agree, and I think it makes it easier for vendors who are trying to do what we want to do to help companies work better because the regulations are the same. If we could get a standard that worked for both of them, I think it would be fantastic all the way around. Yeah. Joe, let me just say we're getting ready to close out on the webinar. I appreciate your time. Sorry for the challenges I had technology wise, but I'm glad you kept talking and kept it going.
I held the show off for you, so don't worry about it.
No, I appreciate it, and really enjoyed this discussion. It's been fantastic. Hopefully, our folks that were in the audience picked up some nuggets that they could take with them. We really want to say thank you for all those that joined in and were part of the conversation or listened in. And once again, if you have questions or any thoughts for Joe or myself, you can follow up on this webinar. You can come back and watch it later. But really enjoyed talking with you, Joe, and wish you success in this new regulatory world that we live in.
No, thank you for the invite, and then I had a pleasure today speaking on this panel and helping with the community as well too. So thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your time and your cooperation joining us today. We wish you a great day and once again, as I mentioned to Joe, a great experience with the new regulations that we live in. Thank you.